So hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to officially start this session today, which is on the First Amendment, and it's on the Assembly and Petition Clause. So welcome. It's great to have you all. I know people are rolling in right now, so don't worry. We just got started. My name is Kerry Sautner, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, which I'm virtually in right now. It's great to have everybody online, everybody for this discussion. So Assembly and Petition, this is what we're going to go through today. But just real quickly about the Constitution Center, we have all of this great material free online. So if you want to look over this material later and dive deep into it, I suggest you go to the Interactive Constitution and check out the Assembly and Petition Clause, the explainers, the agreement, the great court cases. Jeff is going to go through a whole bunch of stories, and we will send you a document after this session that has links to all of those stories. So if it goes fast and you want to take notes, take notes. But if it goes too fast and you feel like you've missed it, don't worry, we're here to help. And you can always email me, ksautner@constitutioncenter.org, if any clarifying questions. So today we're going to make sure we give you a lot of the founding stories. And to be honest with you, a lot of these stories on Assembly and Petition come before we were even a country. So what happened before us to really give us these great ideas for our First Amendment? We're going to be asking those constitutional questions, and those are great to put in the Q&A box. So open up that Q&A box. If you have a question for Jeff, put it in there, and I'll do my best to get it to him during the conversation. In the chat box, if you need any clarity, let me know, but we'll also be polling you throughout the conversation. So I'll be putting the poll questions in there. So everybody keep things open, keep things moving, and we'll have a lot of fun today. So without further ado, do you want to start with the Florida case, Jeff?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone.
I knew you would love it. Welcome, Jeff.
I see that Evan is here from Florida, and we have, I'm sure, some other friends joining us from Florida as well. And there's a case from Florida that just happened last week that shows us how important it is for us to learn today about the Assembly and Petition guarantees of the First Amendment. So this is a case that happened when a reverend in a Pentecostal megachurch, his name is Reverend Rodney Howard Brown, held two church services on Sunday. Lawyers said, you can't do that. This puts people in danger of the coronavirus. And the governor has issued recommendations that people not gather in groups larger than 10. The pastor ignored them. He proceeded with his services anyway at the Tampa Bay church. And on Monday, the sheriff of Hillsborough County said he had an arrest warrant for the reverend for intentionally and repeatedly defying emergency orders mandating that people maintain social distancing. So here's the first question I want you all to vote on. Does the arrest of Reverend Howard Brown for attempting to hold an assembly, namely a religious assembly for the purposes of worship services in his church, violate the First Amendment guarantee of Assembly and Petition? And before you can vote on that, we better read the text of the First Amendment, which is always so important. So here it is. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there are two parts of that clause. First, the right of the people peaceably to assemble. That's called the Assembly Clause. And the second is the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's called the Petition Clause. And my question to you is, do you believe that the arrest of the Reverend for trying to hold an assembly for religious purposes during the coronavirus violates the Assembly Clause of the First Amendment? Okay, let's have some votes in the chat. And you can vote.
So, and again, as always.
Right, Kerry always reminds me to ask you to separate your political from your constitutional views. The question isn't, do you think it's a good idea to stop the Reverend from holding that service? Or would you like to attend the service or not? The question is, does the First Amendment's freedom of assembly clause give him the right to hold that service, even though the state has recommended that people not assemble in groups larger than 10? So if you believe that the First Amendment does grant the Reverend that right, then vote yes. And if you believe the First Amendment does not give him that right, then vote no.
And then there's always, as I like to remind people, you can say, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure is always a good answer because these are hard questions. And we're getting a good balance. Yes, but wouldn't there be an exception so it would be a danger to public health? Tara, that's the central question. Yes, ordinarily, no, since there's a public health emergency. Exactly. That's the question that you're struggling with. Yes, this kind of reminds me of Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Okay, you guys are so on top of this
Smart group.
because that's the central case. Does the clear and present danger test apply? Keep asking these questions for a little bit more because these are exactly the right questions. No, given the public health crisis, and that puts a bunch of points on the table. Okay, so as you all have said, ordinarily, there might be a right to assemble for religious purposes. Indeed, we know that there was such a right because it was an attempt to assemble for religious purposes that was the very case that sparked the Assembly Clause. And I'll tell you that case in a moment. It's the case of William Penn, who tried to assemble to hold Quaker religious services in England in the 17th century. And a jury tried to acquit him from the government officials who tried to prevent those services. And he said, remember your privileges, hold fast to your rights. And the jury was arrested for trying to side with him. So ordinarily, both the Assembly Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, which we talked about last week, for those of you who were able to join us, gives people a right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience and to assemble for that purpose by holding religious services with other people. But I think it was several of you asked, but is there a public safety exception? And that was Tara's question. Would there be an exception because it would be a danger to public health? And then we had the question of the Jacobson case. And the Jacobson case, Massachusetts versus Jacobson, as you note, Isabel, says that people are allowed to be forcibly vaccinated during a health crisis. That was during the yellow fever crisis of the 1890s and the early 19th century, the early 20th century, when Massachusetts wanted to forcibly vaccinate people. Some folks said, no, my religion or my scruples prohibits me from being vaccinated. And the court said, the state does have the police power to vaccinate you because of the threat that a virus poses to others. So the short answer, although there are never clear predictions in cases that the Supreme Court hasn't squarely ruled on, is that I think it's pretty fair to assume that as this case moves up through the courts, they are likely to hold that, yes, there is a public safety exception to the right of assembly. And as long as the regulations are neutral laws of general applicability, it will be upheld. Do you remember, for those of you who were here with us last week, the Smith case? The Smith case said that generally, when there's a neutral law of general applicability, then a particular individual or group can't seek a religious exemption from having to obey it. So a law that generally says you can't, you have to wear regular military hats in the military. An Orthodox Jew says, I want to wear my yarmulke, my kippah, my religious covering. And the court says, too bad, it's a general law that prohibits you from doing that. So as long as the governor weren't saying only churches can't assemble, but other, rock concerts can, or huge assemblies for sports games, that's fine. It's only religions that can't assemble. That would be problematic. But as long as all groups larger than 10 are prohibited and the religion is not being singled out, then it's probably okay. Okay, so that generally introduces the question of the Assembly Clause. Let me just now note some other really interesting cases that the Supreme Court has held, and we'll discuss them now. I'll just put them on the table, and then after we've talked about the Assembly Clause, then we can vote. Can the government require that groups wanting to hold a parade, protest, or other public gathering apply advance for a permit? That's the Cox versus New Hampshire case from 1941. Can the government prohibit large protests like Occupy Wall Street from sleeping overnight in public spaces like parks? That's the Clark versus Community for Creative Nonviolence case from 1982. Can the government require a privately organized parade, namely the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Boston, to include an organization of LGBTQ Irish Americans if it doesn't want to? That's the Hurley versus Irish American Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Group of Boston case from 1985. And finally, can the government prevent someone from speaking because it fears that others will become so outraged, so angry by their words that they'll turn to violence? That's the Terminiello case versus the city of Chicago from 1949. Just before I do some more history, let's just vote on one of these cases because it's so central. Last week we talked about fighting words as an exception to the First Amendment. So let me ask you about that Terminiello case. Can the government prevent someone from speaking because it fears that others will become so inflamed and outraged by their words that they'll turn to violence? Terminiello, 1949. Vote yes if you think that the First Amendment, including its assembly clause, allows the government to prevent someone from speaking because of their outrageous words, which are likely to inflame, and vote no if you think that the government cannot prohibit someone from speaking under those circumstances. Let's see what we got. I'm just looking for the chat. And go ahead, Kerry.
So the yes and no's are coming back. And as we go through this, a lot of people have been asking about time as well on these big questions of assembly. How long can this happen? How long can the government say that pastor can't hold church? And then there was a really good question earlier, and again, it's all in the nuance about what if they went to church but they still kept 6 feet apart? Could that, I know, I love that question. That's why I wanted to just bring it up there.
Totally great.
So as everybody goes through and says yes, no, and answers, or I'm not sure, I need more information, I just thought to fill in a couple of those other questions around the first topic.
Well, they're really important questions. And broadly, let's remember that it's okay for the government to restrict assembly in the name of time, place, and manner. What are time, place, and manner restrictions? They include things like rules that require you to get a permit before holding a parade, or that tell you can't make loud noises at night when people might be sleeping, or next to a school where people might be learning. The basic idea is that government can't restrict the message. It can't prevent me from saying I believe in Jesus Christ or the God of Moses or any God, but it can regulate when I say it or how loudly I say it in order to maintain the public's health, safety, and welfare. So practically, there's this broad First Amendment right to gather together on streets and parks for meetings, to assemble for speeches, parades, protests, marches, picketing, and demonstrations. But the government also has broad discretion to regulate public assemblies in the name of preserving public order. So that is the time, place, and manner test. Technically, it applies to free speech cases, not specifically to assembly cases, but assembly cases are very much part of that. And in the end, it does end up giving the government surprisingly broad discretion. How long can the quarantine order continue? A good question. I mean, you could view the quarantine itself as a kind of time, place, and manner restriction. So if it was a permanent ban, that wouldn't be a time, place, and manner restriction. It would actually be a ban, and it would be forbidden. Do you know that the Prime Minister of Hungary, Mr. Orban, has just suspended all elections in Hungary indefinitely because of the coronavirus? That's a clear autocratic power grab. It would be unconstitutional and impermissible in the US for President Trump or for any state governor indefinitely to delay or postpone all democratic elections. That would not be a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. It would be a clear violation of the right of assembly, petition, and voting. So that wouldn't count. Beyond that, the courts haven't said. There's a lot of discretion about how long a health emergency lasts, so courts aren't likely to second guess it, but that's the broad answer. And then back to the Terminiello case, that was from 1949, and I was seeing lots of votes from all over the spectrum. And the basic thing that the court held, this is 1949, this is a priest, Arthur Terminiello, gives a very angry speech in which he attacks lots of political and racial groups and condemns the protesting crowd that's gathered outside the auditorium. The police can't prevent the disturbance, and they arrest Father Terminiello for a breach of the peace. He's tried and convicted for inciting a riot. Do you remember from last week or so, we talked about what the test is for how imminent the risk of violence has to be in order to be suppressed under the First Amendment? The speech has to be intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That came from the Brandenburg case in 1969. And Terminiello is 20 years before that, 1949, But in the 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court says the breach of the peace law is unconstitutional because the vitality of civil and political institutions in our society depends on free discussion. The speech can only be restricted when the event is likely to produce a clear and present danger of a serious substantive evil that rises far above public inconvenience, annoyance, or unrest. That's a clunkier way of expressing the test of Brandenburg, intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, but it's very much the same idea. It has to be likely to produce the clear and present danger. The evil has to be serious and substantive. It can't just be public inconvenience, annoyance, or unrest. And the crucial idea behind this case is that there's no such thing in the US as the heckler's veto. What do you imagine a heckler's veto is? I don't know if it's worth asking you to chat.
Yeah, I'm going to put it in right now just in case.
What's a heckler's veto?
And earlier somebody asked the question about, well, you can't tell what the crowd's going to do. So a crowd's assembling and you're giving a speech. You're the person giving the speech can't tell what the crowd is going to do. So who gets measured in that? Crucial question.
Or say I'm giving this class. Some of you may be interested. Maybe some of you are, your minds are wandering. I don't know exactly how you're going to receive it. I'm just doing my best to tell you about the Petition and Assembly Clause. Surely the constitutionality of my speech shouldn't depend on whether you happen to be unusually sensitive or insensitive. Imagine you took incredible offense to the fact that I asked you what a heckler's veto was and began to have a little riot in your home. Well, that wouldn't be reasonable. That's not a fair way of allowing everyone else to hear what I have to say for what it's worth. So the basic idea of the heckler's veto is if you're the heckler who's so sensitive that you say, Jeff, stop talking. I really want to stop hearing about the First Amendment and go back to Minecraft, that would not be a grounds for suppressing my speech. In America, generally, it is the speaker who presumptively has the right to be heard as long as it meets all time, place, and manner restrictions. And unless my speech is so outrageous that it's both intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, then your likely reaction shouldn't matter. So that's the answer. The permissibility of the speech is not judged by an attempt to predict the reaction of the audience, but instead by the objective question of both my intent in making it and also its objective and likely effect. So it's a very powerful protection for free speech, and we must remember it in these anxious times ahead.
So getting back to that idea that, okay, so you're measuring what the speaker is saying, and there's a great question in here about who rates and who measures that, who rates the danger of the situation. But thinking about it in the terms of assembly, can I just go out there? I mean, again, say it was 6 months ago. So right now is a little different than 6 months ago. Can I go out there and just begin speaking in the middle of Independence Hall right behind me? Can I walk straight out there and just start speaking, even if the danger is very low? Am I allowed to do that? And thousands of people, because I'm a really good speaker, start to gather. Could we possibly do that?
Well, I would rally up to hear you, Kerry.
You're already there.
You're already here. Absolutely. And many people would as well. And that's why we're all here gathering virtually, because you're such a great teacher. But you know well, because we work on Independence Mall, if you want to hold a big protest in advance, you generally have to get a permit. For example, there was I think it was a pro-Bernie Sanders rally a few months ago. Bernie Sanders just today dropped out of the presidential race, but some folks wanted to hold a rally in his favor a few months ago in front of the Constitution Center, and they had to get a permit first. And there was some other people wanted to get a rally against President Trump, and they had to get a permit. Now, in deciding whether to give the permit, the Park Service is not allowed to discriminate on the basis of message or viewpoint. They can't say, yes, you can have a pro-Bernie rally, but you can't have a pro-President Trump rally. That would be viewpoint discrimination and would be unconstitutional. But in order to regulate the safety and order on the mall, they can say, you've got to protest here. They can't touch my hand in the opposite screen because it disappears. Ooh, like in this kind of funny flat screen way, because friends, it's not the real Constitution Center behind me. But basically, you could protest on the grass right behind me, but you couldn't protest right at the front door, right in order right before you get into the Constitution Center, because otherwise people couldn't get into the Constitution Center. That would be a valid time, place, and manner restriction. And who rates the danger, Gwyneth? Well, generally, police officers on the ground. I've been in situations at the Constitution Center. We've held public programs, and Charles Ramsey, the police chief of Philadelphia, was giving a talk, and some Black Lives Matter protesters began to protest him. And you're absolutely allowed silently to protest at the Constitution Center. So when people got up silently and protest and turned their back on him, that was okay. But when people started to chant and yell, then the police officers on the scene made the judgment, this is a kind of heckler's veto. And they politely, thankfully, asked the protesters to leave. And in that case, the protesters did, in fact, leave. So that was a good example of the First Amendment working the way that it's supposed to. But it's really tough. And in a case like Charlottesville, remember how terribly violent and fearful that was when someone was killed by a runaway car and there were guns. Deciding when to intervene is a very tough call. Easy for judges in retrospect to say what's reasonable, but on the ground, it's often up to police officers to make these decisions. Okay, so what do you think, Chris? Should we do some history?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm dying. So now we understand like this concept of how it's working, especially in our front lawn, and how it works, and that there's restrictions in the local government around time, place, manner. Like your town could have different rules. My dad's town in Florida, it's very early. But what was the goal with the founding fathers? Why did they want freedom of assembly in there? What were they trying to protect and preserve for all the people?
So the crucial initial idea was assembly to worship. And that was the trial of William Penn. That was in the 17th century. And Penn was in England, which had an official religion, the Church of England. There was an act banning religious assemblies of over 5 people outside the official church. He was arrested for holding a Quaker meeting in violation of the law. Basically, he was just practicing his Quaker faith in public. The jury initially refused to punish him for unlawful assembly, even though he was clearly guilty under the letter of the law, because the jurors believed that we have a natural right of conscience, which included a right to assemble for the purpose of expressing our beliefs. The judge imprisoned members of the jury without food or water and threatened to keep them there until they convicted him. Penn shouted to the jury, "You are Englishmen, mind your privilege, give not away your right." Isn't that a wonderful cry? Mind your privilege, give not away your right. When you see your fellow citizens meekly submitting to the surrender of a right that you know that the Constitution guarantees, you too can cry out, mind your privilege. I can't help but thinking that in the subways in Britain, those wonderful underground subways, there's a really terrifying loud voice that says, "Mind the gap." And they mean when you're stepping outside the subway, there's this huge gap between the subway and the platform, and you shouldn't fall in. So mind the gap is the way you can remember mind your privilege, because when you don't mind your privilege, then it may fall into the gap and allow liberty to be thwarted. Okay, so that's the story of William Penn. And then more other really important founding stories included abolitionists, people who were opposing slavery, who were trying to argue against it. And an anti-slavery lawyer in New York named Alva Stewart said, "Anti-abolitionists say they believe in free discussion in the abstract, but must not discuss it in public." And Alva Stewart said that's a violation of the right of assembly. There was an incident in Oneida County in New York in 1835 where abolitionists got permission to meet at a courthouse. Oneida County Democrats resolved that the meeting of incendiary individuals not be permitted in public and demanded that all courtrooms, schools, and churches should close their door against these wicked and deluded men. A mob forced the abolitionists to hold their next meeting, not in public, but at an abolitionist's house. So that's why before the Civil War, there were laws in states like North Carolina and Alabama banning expression with a tendency to incite violence or insurrection. That's why Missouri banned anti-slavery speeches, and why states across the South limited abolitionist meetings, prevented them from mailing their materials through the mail. And even in Philadelphia in 1835, mass meetings resolved that actions of abolitionists in organizing societies are unwise, dangerous, and deserving emphatic reprehension and zealous opposition. So, and these were so clearly unconstitutional according to the spirit of the Constitution that Frederick Douglass, in a very moving plea for free speech in Boston 1860, explicitly called for respecting the right to speech and assembly against mob violence. And now I think, since we're talking about the history and the intricate connection between the rights of assembly and abolitionist or anti-slavery expression, now is the time also for me to tell the founding story behind the right to petition clause. Kerry, can I do that? Because the two work neatly together?
Yeah, absolutely. They're so closely together. There you go. Petition.
Okay, petition. So petition, remember, is the second clause of the Assembly and Petition Clause. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So what's the most famous petition for a redress of grievances in US history around the time of the framing? Well, instead of just playing question and answer for too long, it was the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration was a justification for our split with England after years of ignored petitions by the colonists to King George. The colonists had used their petition to reach out to the British Crown, like John Dickinson's Olive Branch petition, or other colonial legislatures who wrote to the king objecting to the intolerable acts or to the writs of assistance. And the colonists kept sending these petitions and the king kept ignoring them. And finally, we wrote the Declaration of Independence, which said, here are all the ways that you've ignored our petitions and violated our rights. We're gonna break from the crown. But in 1777, already there were petitions for freedom of slaves. And that's why I'm telling this story now, because the history of the right to petition is intricately connected to petitions about the unconstitutionality of slavery. In 1777, there was a petition for freedom offered to the Massachusetts House of Representatives on behalf of 7 African Americans. The petition drew on the Declaration of Independence and argued slavery violates natural law. And one of the most famous anti-slavery petitions came when Benjamin Franklin in 1790 presented an anti-slavery petition to Congress. Pennsylvania had the first abolition society in the country. The Quakers took the lead. Isn't that interesting? We had Quakers for William Penn for the free assembly clause, and also Quakers at the center of the petition clause. And in Ben Franklin's final public act, although he turned to abolitionism late in life, he sent a petition in 1790 to Congress on behalf of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, calling for an end to the slave trade. It asked the first Congress to devise a means for removing the inconsistency from the character of the American people and to promote mercy and justice toward this distressed race, as he called it, namely African Americans. And then it said, listen to this amazing quotation from the Declaration of Independence. The petition said that mankind are all formed by the same almighty being, alike objects of his care, and equally designed for the enjoyment of happiness. The Christian religion teaches us to believe, and the political creed of America fully coincides with the position. Isn't that a beautiful idea of all of us being equally equally designed for the enjoyment of happiness? The petition goes to the House and Senate. There's a big debate. The Senate ignores it. The House sends it to a select committee and eventually tables the resolution, concluding that the Constitution itself limits Congress's power to end the slave trade until 1808. But then, and this is my last founding story, and then we'll see what you guys make of it. In the 1830s, then the abolitionist movement is really up and running. And John Quincy Adams, former president of the United States, now going back and serving in the House of Representatives, gets involved in a battle over Congress's gag rule. John Quincy Adams is defeated for a second term as president. He's elected to the House of Representatives. Between 1831 and 1836, anti-slavery forces lead a massive petition drive with over 100,000 petitions sent to the House of Representatives and the Senate, asking Congress to abolish slavery or restrict its expansion. John Quincy Adams introduces these petitions, provoking a near riot in Congress. The House leadership, driven by pro-slavery forces, imposes a gag rule limiting petitions. It automatically tables anti-slavery petitions, but preventing them from being read or discussed. And their argument is that Congress shouldn't act on the petitions because the national government doesn't have the constitutional power to attack slavery. Adams says this violates the First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The petitions keep coming anyway, 1,500 between December and March 1838 and 1839. And Congress eventually, this is this wonderful end to the story, repudiates the gag rule itself as unconstitutional, and the House ends it in 1844 by an 1808 to an 80 vote, and it's John Quincy Adams who writes the repeal petition and secures the vote to pass it. Isn't that an inspiring story? And it's just a very powerful example of the central meaning of the petition clause in action on the floor of the House, led by former president and now Representative John Quincy Adams. So there are two big founding stories, William Penn and the Quakers, mind the gap, mind your privileges. Now even I remember it.
I know. Great mnemonic device. We all will never go through the subway again or the tube in England again without hearing mind your privilege.
It's a very scary thing. Otherwise, the tube is a wonderful experience. But William Penn for the Assembly clause and John Quincy Adams for the petition clause. Okay, some questions before we get back to the cases.
Yeah, so some questions around this. So was it the intent with both the Assembly and petition of the Founding Fathers to be able to allow all voices to be heard through this process? Because when you have a petition, it goes to Congress. And what John Quincy Adams did was to get this into the dialogue, into the conversation. So was this always intended to be a tool for underrepresented or non-represented people to have their voice in the government?
Well, I think it's the founders themselves probably weren't thinking as much about underrepresented people, although certainly Benjamin Franklin's example suggests that some of them were, and there was enough of an anti-slavery contingent among the founders that the earliest exercises of the right of petition were on behalf of enslaved people. But the founders themselves also used petitions for rights that affected their own interests, including James Madison's famous memorial and remonstrance. Remember that from last week as well? It kind of all comes together in the First Amendment. Madison's memorial and remonstrance was submitted to the Virginia legislature in opposition to Patrick Henry's effort to tax people to support the Anglican Church. And Madison said that violates the natural rights of conscience, and he expressed that in the form of a petition, the memorial and remonstrance, that was signed by tens of thousands of citizens. But the beautiful thing about the rights of petition and the rights of assembly is that underrepresented groups claim them as their birthright and assert them on their own. So it was not just John Quincy Adams who introduced those anti-slavery petitions to Congress. There were petitions from African-American conventions seeking equal citizenship, both before, during, and after the Civil War, where African-Americans met to advance a vision of racial equality. And in 1865, Charles Sumner offered a petition to Congress from newly freed slaves in South Carolina, calling for constitutional protections in keeping arms, in holding public assemblies, and in complete liberty of speech and of the press. Isn't that a beautiful coming together of a petition on behalf of the right to assembly and to exercise speech and the press? The petition clause is being used for African Americans, newly freed African Americans, to argue for Congress to respect their other First Amendment rights. And then other underrepresented groups like women then seize their rights. And in 1866, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I just learned to pronounce it Katie rather than Caddy, spearheaded a petition drive that led to thousands of women to petition Congress for the right of women to vote. And that culminated in the protests before the White House in 1918 that eventually led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, 100 years ago today. So that Justice Ginsburg has used a beautiful phrase. She says that the Constitution has ever become more embracive and has included more and more underrepresented groups in its embrace, and the rights of petition and assembly are among the rights that have embraced underrepresented groups over time.
So I will send out to everybody, we have an amazing theater piece that walks through the primary sources of the Colored People's Convention in South Carolina. So everybody on this group, I'm going to send you a video clip of that happening at the Constitution Center, and you will be able to hear what Jeff was just talking about, the actual words of the people asking for their rights and petitioning their government to have their voices heard in the writing of these Reconstruction amendments. And Jeff, just to clarify, Alice Paul's protest on the White House, that's the first ever protest of the White House in all time was done by women, correct?
That's so inspiring, and it built on. It was after Woodrow Wilson's reelection. It was in 1916 that she called on members of the National Women's Party to picket the White House and to put pressure on Democratic senators to vote for the 19th Amendment. They hold up banners that draw on the language of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. One of them read, "Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed." Eventually, President Wilson relents and supports the 19th Amendment. But here's another inspiring connection between the rights of assembly and petition. In quoting the Declaration of Independence in their petitions, those brave women invoke one of the most famous assemblies or conventions in American history, and that's the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where women assembled and produced one of the most famous documents in American history, the Declaration of Sentiments, using the Declaration of Independence as a model to explain a series of wrongs against women and embracing a vision of an America in which men and women are treated equally. So the assembly and petition rights really do go hand in glove, as it were. They go together. You assemble at Seneca Falls to assert and declare and debate your natural rights as women and equal citizens, and then you petition President and the Congress to recognize them through a constitutional amendment. One surprising turn in Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's treatment of the rights of the assembly and petition is that those rights have kind of merged into the general First Amendment rights of free expression. And most of the 20th century and 21st century cases that we have involve abstract claims like expressive advocacy rather than the more particularized rights of assembly and petition. So I began by asking you about the parade. Do the Boy Scouts have the right to ban gays and lesbians from their parade in Boston? Because at the time, although not now, they were opposed to gay and lesbian scoutmasters. And the Supreme Court, I'll ask you, what do you think the right answer is? But as you prepare to vote, do you believe that the First Amendment rights of assembly and petition allow the Boy Scouts to exclude the gay people or not? The court decided that on grounds of expressive advocacy or symbolic expression rather than the more particularized rights of assembly. So I think that's too bad in some ways, that this very beautiful particularized history of separate rights of assembly and petition have been merged into the general speech right, because we lose some of the power of that history. But that's what the court decided. Okay, so you can check it out if you want, but what do you think the right answer is in this case, Hurley versus Irish American gay, lesbian, and bisexual group? Do you believe that the Boy Scouts should have the right to exclude the gay gay people or not?
So as everybody kind of puts in their vote on this question, just for a little clarity, John wrote in, and it was exactly what you were talking about a minute ago, and just needs an exact definition of petition and how does it differ from speech. So going on that idea of free expression. So petition is much those connecting between the two, because they all are connected, and this is why they're all in that First Amendment together, and this is why we spend weeks talking about the First Amendment. It's really big, people. They jammed a lot in there.
They really do, and they do meld together. And Paula, you're absolutely right. I think you're mixing up the parade and the Boy Scouts. I was, because both involved the right to exclude gay people, but the parade case was a group called the South Boston Allied War Veterans Council, and it was a St. Patrick's Day parade. And the question was, could they could this council organizing the St. Patrick's Day parade refuse to allow the Irish American gay, lesbian, and bisexual group of Boston to march? So thank you, Paula, for that. And Paula, I know you know the answer because you know the case. But so what I want you to vote on is the question in the Hurley case: should the organizers of the Boston St. Patrick's Day parade have the right to ban the Irish American gay, lesbian, and bisexual group or not? So vote yes if you think that the First Amendment allows them to ban the Irish American gay, lesbian, and bisexual group, and vote no if you think that the First Amendment does not allow them to engage in that ban. And we're saying some yes and some no. Just a quick vote here. And it's a mix. This is an interesting, since the Boy Scouts are a private institution, it's true. Yes, Tara's right about the Boy Scouts case, which is separate as a private institution. I think, unfortunately, in this case, as Isabel, they do have the right to exclude because they're a private organization. Yes, yes, yes. And now I can share with you the fact, here is Kerry's just putting up the case name, so you can all check it out yourself. And if you've done that, then you know that the Supreme Court unanimously concluded that the state ruling violated the First Amendment. The state cannot require private citizens who organize a parade to include a group expressing a message the organizers don't wish to convey. The court argued that that action violates the fundamental First Amendment rule that a speaker has autonomy to choose the content of his own message and conversely to decide what not to say. So those of you who said that as a private organization, the Boy Scouts had a collective right to speak or not to speak in accordance with their own beliefs were correct. And the court unanimously, that's 9-0, so it was not a close call, concluded that to force the inclusion of the Irish American gay and lesbian group would be a form of compelled speech, suggesting that the group was endorsing their message, and therefore you couldn't be required to allow that group to march. Powerful. I guess I could ask you what whether you agree or disagree, and do think about it. But recognize that at least at the time that ruling was unanimous and is a powerful statement of what the Supreme Court believes is a core meaning of the First Amendment right of assembly.
So
okay,
a couple questions here. So one, just a note, because I really love Paula's comment here. She lives in the Boston area, and the mayor refused to attend the parade unless everybody was included. So there's a little speech to counter speech, and meaning action by the mayor to counter that speech. But a question that Yusuf asked in the beginning, and I think it's really important to think about, we love assembly and petition. I mean, we love the entire Constitution, but we feel like people don't talk enough about assembly and petition. And this is why we're having this class this week. But Yusuf asked in the beginning, how can citizens of the United States assert our rights and our freedom of assembly and petition? What actions can we take to utilize assembly and petition?
Well, we can start by doing what we're doing now, which is assembling virtually, which is very important. And then you can, of course, use the internet to petition. And it's a wonderfully empowering tool. We've seen examples of times when Twitter polls and Facebook efforts have actually changed public policy. I remember back in the days of net neutrality, when there was an argument about whether or not the platform should have to accept all speakers on equal terms, a tremendous bit of online activism changed the public debate and actually swayed Congress's position. Now, those aren't formal petitions, but maybe in the age of social media, that kind of bottom-up mobilization online is even more powerful than a formal petition, which Congress has to accept or reject. I'm just thinking aloud here, but it's true, isn't it, that in some ways you're much more likely to affect your representatives' vote if you can get tens of thousands of people on Twitter to support you, rather than if you just write a formal petition, which is signed by a lot of people, and send it in. So the Supreme Court hasn't yet confronted whether or not a Twitter poll or a series of requests for some kind of action have to be responded to. It's not even clear whether Congress has an obligation to respond to petitions. But that's just my thought. But I have to throw it back at you if I can. If this chat works indirectly, that was Yusuf's question?
Yes.
Yusuf, how do you think you could best exercise your rights of petition today in the age of online expression?
And as Yusuf ponders that, we'll give Yusuf a second to answer.
Yeah,
Think about
sorry to
that.
throw it at you, but you ask a good question, you get one back.
I know, right? And that's a great teacher for you. Lauren, who's one of our teachers from our Teachers Advisory Board, wanted to know if you can. Some people claim that the right to petition has fallen to bureaucracy as opposed to Congress because of the way the government is organized. And I know that Lauren was there last year when we had Maggie Blackhawk, a professor at Penn, talk around the idea of the use of petition over time and how it's being less used now because of the state of the government, the size of the government, but also the idea of how can technology support bring that back. So do you want to kind of address that idea of petition as being less used in the last, say, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, it's really powerful. I mean, first, if you go on to the interactive constitution essays on the Assembly and Petition Clause, you'll see the common explainer lament the fact, and this is John Anazu and Bert Newborn, our liberal and conservative scholars, regret the fact that assembly and petition have fallen out of fashion before the courts and have been subsumed into the more general First Amendment rights of free expression. And then, as Maggie Blackhawk said, one of the risks of representative democracy today is elected officials can be more responsive to their most mobilized partisan supporters rather than viewing themselves as agents of all the people. The right of petition is designed to minimize that risk, and that's why Congress was supposed to acknowledge and respond to petitions from ordinary people. But today, in Congress and state legislatures, as Professor Blackhawk has said, the right to petition has been reduced to a formality. Petitions are routinely entered into the public record without any obligation to debate the matters raised or respond. And in a political system where incumbents can make it all but impossible to mount credible reelection challenges, an energized right to petition could link modern legislators more closely to the entire electorate they're pledged to serve rather than just responding to their mobilized base. So some scholars have argued for that reasons that the petition clause includes an implied duty to acknowledge, debate, or even vote on issues raised by petition. And this question of whether internet petitions by organizations like Move On or the conservative PACs should require a response is very much alive. I think the lower courts have not debated it, but it's quite relevant to the vibrancy of the right today.
So one more question, and we're running out of time. So there was a question earlier that's in the chat box, the Q&A box, and it really does go back to one of our original questions about assembly and how long can the government bring back assembly or stop assembly of people, and it's around voting. And so this idea of, and I know we addressed it lightly earlier about the government cannot say we're not having an election because we don't have a way to vote together, so therefore we're not assembling for vote. But the case just came down about pushing primaries back. Yes. And the governor, and different states are doing this, and the governor, and I'm blanking on the state that this happened to, but the court said, no, you can't push the primary back that far. And again, I know this is a loose connection to assembly, but it's one of the times in America that we physically assemble together to have our right to vote. So they're all kind of connected together. And where's the balance between that type of assembly that is a part of our system and the government keeping public order, and for how long?
Yes, so that case is very important. It came down yesterday. I'd like you to read it. You know, remember I give you homework every time? And the homework is, but it's good homework because it's so interesting to read these decisions. The homework is to read a Supreme Court decision that came down yesterday that has huge implications, possibly for the 2020 elections going forward. It's not a long decision, you'll be glad to know. There's a per curiam, which means by the whole court, which was signed by the 5 conservative justices, although it doesn't have anyone's name on it. And then there's a very strong dissent by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, signed by the 4 liberal justices. And broadly, the majority opinion says that the state of Wisconsin, when the governor decided to allow ballots, mail-in ballots, that were received after yesterday, which was April 7th, but before the deadline for counting the ballot, which had been extended to April 13th, he said those could be counted. And a majority of the court said no. Generally, courts are not supposed to intervene in elections at the last minute. This could be really disruptive. And in the interests of regularity, we have to only allow ballots that are mailed and postmarked by April 7th to be counted, even though they can be counted until April 13th. The dissent by Justice Ginsburg said, are you kidding? People have asked for absentee ballots weeks ago, and they still haven't received them because the post offices are closed. And if we enforce this arbitrary deadline and don't allow ballots that were requested but not able to be mailed before April 7th because they haven't been received, not to be counted by the deadline of April 13th, then literally thousands or tens of thousands of people will face a choice between voting and health. They're going to have to stand physically in line or not be able to vote at all. And she said, there's no possible interests of equal counting of the ballots that could be served by this completely arbitrary cutoff, and therefore the court should have stayed out of this. So you should, please, if you do, take time to read this, and as a citizen, you'll be really educated and you'll also have a stronger sense, although the majority said, we're not expressing any opinion on all the other election issues that might come up having to do with the 2020 election. You can decide whether you think that there's some tea leaves that can be read from this. But if you read the majority and read the dissent, and if you find one more convincing than the other, write to me or Kerry or both of us, jrosen@constitutioncenter.org, Sautner@constitutioncenter.org, and tell us why. You just have to give us your constitutional reasonings. You can say, I found the majority more convincing on constitutional grounds for this reason, or I found the dissent more convincing for this reason. That's the way I want you to evaluate all of these decisions, not in terms of your political preferences. I don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or who you think should win an election, but in terms of your constitutional views, who do you think had the more persuasive constitutional argument? And if you can separate the two and reach a constitutional conclusion that diverges from your political views, saying, for example, I think the election ballots should be counted, even though I'm a Republican, I think that'll help Democrats, but I think the Constitution compels that, or vice versa, I think the ballot shouldn't be counted, even though I'm a Democrat and that'll help Republicans. So much the better, because then you know you're being principled. You're separating your political from your constitutional views and reposing in the cool light of reason.
And on that note, we are wrapping up right now. So Jeff, I know we always like to wrap up with the same question. And with assembly and petition, I think the question lies not just was your mind more open, but I want to also ask everybody, are they become more aware of the reasoning behind assembly and petition, but also the need for assembly and petition in our Constitution? So you always frame the questions in a perfect way. So I'm just going to toss it back at you. What is our wrap-up question for everybody? And answer in the chat box. And Youssef lost us for a minute and is back on and is thinking of ideas. I just wanted to let you know he's there. But what's your wrap-up question for everybody to answer in the chat box about assembly and petition?
Well, let's close with a concrete case, and then I'm going to ask you whether you're approaching it differently after the discussion. So I think the concrete case, you know what, it's a tough one, but it's really important, and it's the most modern assembly and petition case. It's called Doe versus Reed. And the question is, if you sign a petition for an it was a Washington state constitution, and it was a referendum, and it was an anti-gay marriage referendum. And basically a lot of people signed the referendum. Some voted for gay marriage, others against. And the question is, does your name have to be public? Can you vote anonymously, or is it a violation of your rights of petition to require that your name be public when you sign this petition? Okay. So it's really interesting because I want you to think about questions like, are you less likely to feel free to vote one way or the other if you know that your name is going to be public? Does that infringe on your right of petition? Or is it perfectly acceptable in the name of public accountability? So who believes that there it's okay to have a requirement under the Public Records Act to publicize the names of everyone who signs the gay marriage referendum?
And as everybody's thinking about that answer, Lauren did point out that if your students are on here as well and you're some of the teachers, these are great questions to ask them to write a little bit back to you for a recap. And Yusuf was just sharing about how you're able in this country without the quarantine to be able to get out and protest, and that is something that with having the right protest and what you believe in to share those information. So a lot of chat going on over here.
Yusuf, that's such a great point about not all countries around the world have the freedom to assemble and petition, especially in the world's remaining communist countries and in certain Islamic nations. And we just did a great We the People podcast, which we recorded yesterday. It'll post on Thursday, about how authoritarian countries around the world are just clamping down on all public protests in the name of the coronavirus, but it's an excuse. And check that out because it was a very illuminating discussion about how the rights of assembly and petition are really being threatened by the virus. A few votes. I think petition should be public record. Votes should be kept private. I don't think it violates your right to petition if your name is public, if it's a public petition. It's not okay to publish all of their names because there's a threat of harm, damage coming them due to their decision. Okay, great. So believe it or not, or for whether you're surprised or not, the decision was 8-1, agreeing with Isabel. It does not violate your right to petition if your name is public, if it's a public petition. But Justice Clarence Thomas agreed with Alyssa in saying that there's a threat of harm or damage coming to them due to their decision. Justice Thomas said once it was revealed that some people voted against this gay marriage referendum, they lost their jobs if they worked in the theater or in other communities where in San Francisco, it's a more liberal community. So if they were revealed to be more conservative on this issue, they might lose their jobs and suffer harm. So he objected, but it was an 8-1 decision. Okay, so now is the final question. Whose mind was open to the arguments on the other side of that petition case? In other words, even if you might not have agreed with Justice Thomas and with Alyssa that publishing names could cause people harm, at least you're more open to the arguments on that side of the case. Absolutely. Great, Isabel. I'm so glad. That's wonderful, Isabel. Thank you, because you said you don't believe that it violates the right, agreeing with the court, but your mind was open. Yes. Beautiful. Thank you so much. That's the point of these discussions, isn't it? Because I have to tell you, friends, each time I teach these subjects, I realize how little I know and how much I need a discussion with you to really formulate my feelings. There's so much to learn about the Constitution, and we must approach all these questions with an open mind, because these are all the interesting questions are open questions. Is there a right of internet petition? Should Congress have to respond to Twitter polls? The courts haven't decided. And if you think about these questions deeply and you take the time, as we're doing together today, to read the text, learn about the founding history, see how it's evolved over time, and learn about the cases, then you can reach a reasoned judgment just as powerfully as the judges who are grappling with this question for the first time. So all of our minds are opened by learning together. And I guess I'll just end with my favorite exhortation from Louis Brandeis, because it's so meaningful. Come, let us reason together. Come tomorrow. We can reason together more about the Assembly Petition Clause, and definitely come, if you don't want an encore of this class, on Friday, when Kerry and I will be talking to Alex Coe, the author of a new biography of George Washington called You Never Forget Your First Time. And it's a kind of very cheeky and powerful case that we should see Washington in all of his faults and have a full picture of him. And it's got a lot of energy. And it's supposed to be a great book. I'm looking forward to reading it, which I'll do before Friday, and to interviewing Alex Coe about it. So join us on Friday for a discussion of the constitutional legacy of George Washington with the very energetic author, Alex Coe.
Thank you, everybody, so much. We appreciate you so much. Lauren suggested that these book readings are our Corona projects. And I think that's a brilliant way to think about the time that we have. We can still be with each other and we can still have these conversations, and we will all read at least one new book. So thank you all so much. Yusef, it's great to have you on here as well.
Yes,
Everybody
indeed.
have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye. See you Friday. See you soon,
See
Kurt.
you soon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.